Hi, welcome. So excited to be here today for this Behind the Pages Conversations with Leadership Authors conversation. My name is Dr. Julie Pham, and the founder and CEO of Curiosity Base. And this is where we have conversations with a diverse range of leadership authors, many of whom we feature in our leadership book list. So before I introduce our guest, by the way, that's Rosie Kennedy there. Wave your hand. Before we go into this conversation with our special guest today, I just want to give you a little bit of background. We started creating these leadership book lists last year to promote how many different perspectives, leadership perspectives there are written by those who are underrepresented. And so every month we do a new list. And this month, in honor of Women's History Month, we have updated our list. And we have got over 500 books on this list. Oh my gosh. And so when people say, "Oh, well, I don't know who to read," check out our book list, because there is no shortage of books to read here. And so remember, if you want to enrich how you lead, expand who you read. There's so many different leadership narratives out there. So today I get to have a conversation with my dear friend, Rozella Kennedy, Rosie. So for this Behind the Pages Conversations with Leadership Authors. And Rosie is the author of Our Brave Foremothers, celebrating 100 Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous women women of color who changed the course of history. So you can see I really enjoyed this book. I've got lots of bookmarks here. and Rosie is also the founder of the Brave Sis brand, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about it. But I just have to tell you, she gave me the 2022 one, Journey Journal, when we met, and then I ended up buying this one for myself and also for my friends too. This is the 2023 journal, and I love this journal, and she will tell you more about the connection. So, Rosie, could you just give a little brief overview of who you are, and then we'll get into our conversation
Sure.
and questions.
Thank you, Julie. I want to start by saying, we moved from the Bay Area to Seattle in October. And when you and I met, I think it was in August, it was, or something like that. And I was just like, I am so ready to move and be up here. Look at the circle of friends that awaits me. And, my husband, when we all got together, he's like, Julie, Pham is amazing. And so I just want to thank you for having me on, and also just being my friend and making me feel so welcome to the Pacific Northwest. So I'm a native New Yorker, but I left New York in '99, and I've lived increasingly on the West ever since then. I lived in New Mexico, and then we were in the Bay Area for a decade. We moved up here. In addition to all the work I do with Brave Sis and having written this book, I'm also, and this is how we got to meet, the director of impact and equity for global strategic consultancy firm, Camber Collective. And what's so wonderful about my life right now is that my day job really aligns with what I've been trying to do with Brave Sis, because we're really trying at Camber to build the kind of work that is about equity at the core, and really and not performative, like really authentic. And what I think, and what you and I have discussed, and many others have written about, is that at the core of any sort of behavioral change or shift towards greater equity, it starts with yourself. If you can't shift the way you see yourself vis-a-vis the world, nothing's going to stick, and it's going to be labor, it's going to be performative. When the going gets tough, you'll swing back. And so, as someone who works in something somewhat aligned with DEI work, the thing I always tell people is, how are you decentering the default whiteness narrative? How are you decentering this idea that if you are white, you're the center of the universe and everyone else is an asterisk? That was the impetus behind creating the Brave Sis Project. In 2019, I had gone through a really difficult personal and professional time, and I wanted to become more accountable to myself. And so I said, well, I'm going to create a journal, and, I'll start journaling and keeping track of myself. And everything I saw in the market was trash, right? It was like for white women, and it was like, unicorns and size 0 bamboo pants on the beach, and it's like, what? Or the ones for Black women were like, oh, you go queen, on the cover. And then inside it was just generic as heck. And I just thought that was wrong. And so I said, well, I'm going to create my own. I'm a creative person. I can do this. And on Christmas morning, 2019, I had a visitation experience, which, I'm not that woo woo, but I was in that moment. And it said, tell my story. And I jumped out of bed and I was like, something is telling me to tell a story. And so I started researching all these women. And then a girlfriend of mine said, if you include famous people like Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald and, Toni Morrison, their estates might want you to give them money for using. And I was like, well, forget that. So that's what led to really focusing on women that people hadn't heard of. And that's when the whole project took form. And it really became a way of paying homage. We talk about citizen scientists a lot. And I hope that this project and the book and everything starts to create a sense of citizen historians. That we all can start to look into the folks around us whose story, even in our family or communities, who have really made an impact and haven't been celebrated enough.
Well, Rosie, one of the things that when I started going through my own journal journey, I was just, whoa, there's so many people, so many women I've never heard of. And so I love how the story of constraint, you had this constraint actually made you more creative, and made you more resourceful, and start to look for these stories of these unsung heroes. And because I feel whenever I'm reading the journal and then the book as a historian, it's just like, wow, there's so many different perspectives. And part of decentering is actually just offering something new. And that's what you do with this book. You've got all of these beautiful profiles.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm starting this local group with friends, and this week, and we're going to like talk about a brave cis woman, or, femme identifying person, and then do sharing and all that great stuff. And so the first one we're going to look at is Ella Baker. And I mean, Ella Baker is like one of the most impactful women of the civil rights movement. But because she was a woman, because she refused to bow down to Martin Luther King, she thought she was just as smart as him. Because she was a Black woman, she's highly melanated. She wasn't, because colorism is real, right? And it was back then as well. She's just like almost forgotten. And she was one of the most important people behind the scenes. And just think how much richer we'd be. I'm looking forward to our Brave Foremothers being banned in Florida. I said that'd be a badge
That's
of
when you
honor.
know.
Yeah, so you're on the right track.
Yeah. So I have so many questions for you, and I know that the audience has questions too. So what I want to do is just I want to learn about you, and for you personally, Rosie. So I've got some questions, and then you're also going to do a book reading. We've asked you to read a selection from the book, and then I've got even more questions about the behind the pages. And so, audience, as I'm asking these questions, please do feel to type in your own questions, and we will show them, and Rosie can answer them as they come up, as we see that they are once we feel, oh, this is a good point to put them into the conversation. So Rosie, let's go back in time. Who were your role models for leadership when you were growing up?
That's an interesting question, because I think I answer it differently now than I would have even a few years ago. There were many. I grew up, with humble people. I was the first to go to college, working class folks striving to get by in this America that we live in. And so I didn't have, it was like church going people and all of that. So I didn't have like role models as a kid in that way. I was fortunate to go to the Brearley School, which is one of the top premier girls schools in New York. So that created this sort of double life and exposure to some of the most elite people in New York. So it was very interesting dual balancing, which has been the story of my life. As a child, I was very inspired by my art teacher because I wanted to be a creative art. I wanted to be a painter, and um, she really gave me the sense that I could be whatever I wanted to be, and no one ever told that that's not on the table. You know this. I mean, when you're first generation anything, the idea of anything that deviates from sort of like the stable job, the government job, the lawyer, whatever, those weren't in on the table. And so I just was thinking back on Mrs. Thompson the other day because she wasn't a wealthy person at all, but she was living her life fully as an artist, and she gave me that sense that, you could determine the parameters of your life. I see that more now with my daughter's generation. They're 21 and 25. A lot of, like, rejection of the sort of typical trajectory of, like, law school or business school or whatever have you, and I appreciate people like that who were real New York City artists in the 50s and 60s, and, I came around in the 70s, and, um, they really pointed the way to being more free in your life, and so that's interesting. But then the other day, my cousin, put something on social media about her mom, and I realized that, like, of all of my grandmother's, like, 13 siblings, this one Aunt Eloise was always the one. She was a little they were all very religious, but she was a little naughty, she was a little flirtatious, she was a little, like, a little spicy. And I was just thinking about her, and I was like, "Wow, I'm kinda like her." And now that I'm older, right, it's like I'm starting to see myself in those people in ways that really push the boundaries of what I would have imagined myself identifying with. So it's a very, reflective moment of life. As you know, I'm about to turn sexty, and we use that phrase deliberately. And so I've been giving a lot of thought about the trajectory of my life and what it all is about. And so, yeah, so I think I have those two really different role models.
Mm,
Not
the
for how to
the
lead as much as just how to live. How to lead.
mhm.
Yeah.
And actually, that's an interesting point. How to live is how to lead. How to lead is how to live. And
Yeah.
just having someone model, oh, you could do something different. And so
Yeah.
you just talked about your aunt. I also know you said your grandmother also had a really big influence.
Well, I think it was her voice that I heard speaking to me saying, "Tell my story." And the interesting thing about doing all the research and meeting these women, like learning about the Ella Bakers and the Fannie Lou Hamers, especially the women of the civil rights, right? Like my grandmother was born in 1919, which is the year of the Red Terror, right? It was the year of all the lynchings, the highest amount, and I knew that growing up. Although, we didn't talk about history, we didn't talk about those things. There's trauma, there's silence, all that, and that leads to the perpetuation of a lot of the trauma and illness, right? I think the most important thing you can do is to get stuff out on the table and talk about it. Um and um she died. She was younger than I am when she died. I think she was 58, and she died because she didn't get good health care, and, like, they were like, "Oh, well, she's got congestive heart failure, so we're gonna just, like, abandon ship." And I was thinking about that, because you don't have to die from congestive heart failure. And then my father's mother, who was also named Rozella, I never knew her. She died when my dad was a teenager because she had pneumonia and the ambulance didn't come. Like, they kept calling it didn't come. So, like, when I meet people in my sort of, like, illustrious life, and, I'm in these high circles a lot of the time, I often bring up those stories because I want them to know how close they are to the sort of degradations and deprivations of our inequitable society. You try to think, "Oh, that's someone else." No, it was me. The person sitting right next to this is part of
Mhm.
my actual immediate uh, history. And I think that, I don't approach the work from a punitive place or an argumentative place. It's more of a celebratory thing. But you've also got to know the context that required the bravery that these women, ex you know and they're not just Black women. That's so important, right? There's so many amazing Asian women and Indigenous women and Latinx women. The challenge with well, we'll get into research in a little while, so I'll
Mhm.
hold that response.
So when you were, so you said that you heard your grandmother's voice when you started the Brave Sis project. Can you tell us what inspired you to write the book?
Yeah, so what happened was the project was born, if you will, on Christmas Day 2019. So started working on it on 2020. And the day that I got from the factory the sample, it was like amazing. It was also the day that California shut down for the pandemic. It was the day of the quarantine. So that was bittersweet. And then by the time the summer came around and Breonna Taylor and Armand Aubrey and George Floyd were murdered, we had I did a Kickstarter and I brought in like $25,000. And so I was like, whoa, I guess I got to start a LLC. And the second year it was half as much. And then I stopped doing Kickstarter because it was too much work and too much effort. And I could see the tide, the tide washing back out to sea. And that really discouraged me that, what happened was in that first year, because it was such a splash, a classmate of mine from my school in New York, the Brearley School, works for Algonquin, the publisher. And she saw the book and she loved it. And she was like, I want to introduce you to Workman, the publishing house. And so I met, the daughter of the guy who founded it. And they were like, we love this book. We don't want to do the journal. We don't want to do a calendared book, but we want to do this other book instead. And they were like, can you write us a a prospectus? Can you send us 30 samples, or maybe not 30, maybe 12? And so I did. I picked a couple of women who were in the journals, but also I have about a database of about 550 women now, and people keep sending me more. And so I, just started assembling it. And then next thing I knew, I had a contract, and then I started working on that book. So they're like companion pieces. Yeah.
Mm. An evolution of the journal too.
Yeah.
Do
You
you think
see
you'll ever
that.
do a journal?
Say it again.
Think you'll ever do another journal? Like the
Yes,
journal?
I mean, so you see that even with the one that you got from 2022, plain cover, linen, very kind of muted and classy. The next year, I was like, I got it, yeah, and that was also super thick. Every day had something on every day, and I was like, when I started this, I didn't have like a great job. I had like a boring, bad job. Now I have like a very demanding, very awesome job, and there's only so much of me, so I've had to like, right size things a bit. The new one that you have, the 2023, is smaller, but it's still as rich. Yep. And it's also because, Julie, I do the daily sistery lessons on Instagram. And so that's where people can always get a flourish of new content every day to read about. So I've just tried to make the journal a little more streamlined. And I will be doing a new one. Just heard from my factory guy the other day. It's going to be a perpetual journal because I can't,
Mm.
I'm like just a little old person doing this by myself. I've never paid myself a dime, right? And if I don't start like paying myself a little bit, the IRS is going to be like, this is a hobby. This is not an LLC. And so I'm going to mitigate this problem of the inventory going stale. I mean,
Mhm.
by March no one's buying the book anymore. And so the new one's going to be a perpetual, and the design is amazing. I've been working on it and I love it. It's an outlet. It's a creative outlet for me. So yes, they every February I kind of like get that buzz saying, where are you, Rozella? It's time to start again. And I felt that last month. So I was like, oh, okay.
Well, I know that you're really busy right now because the book is going to come out. This is an advanced copy. It's going to come out next month. So this is behind the pages. Could you do a reading, please? Can you read
Sure.
so people get a sample of what is to come?
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I'm going to read from the intro because the intro kind of gives you a sense of what the whole thing is about and why it's important. So introduction. When we think about women's history, who do we consider and who do we omit? I was intimidated as a little girl when it was time to visit my older aunties. Their dimly lit living rooms, thick upholstered couches covered with yellowing plastic that stuck to the back of my legs, faded photographic triptychs of Jesus, Martin, and JFK above the kitchen entryway. It was a constrained contrast to the colorful, cacophonous 1970s world outside their windows. Though no longer recent urban transplants, they retained many down south mannerisms and admonitions. Don't interrupt. In fact, speak only when asked a question. Sit up straight, young lady. Go get your mama a cool drink. But don't leave that Frigidaire open too long and run up my light bill. My younger self, a tomboy who would have rather been playing wiffle ball with the boys on the neighborhood asphalt diamond, who squawked and guffawed over preteen stuff with my schoolmates, was forced into a rigid mold of respectful ladylikeness. Little did I realize that these snippets of time and talk, tales of bills, bad boyfriends, and church going husbands, Jesus, wayward adult children getting into all kinds of trouble, not the John Lewis good trouble kind of trouble, just bad trouble, Jesus, tisking about the war, fretting about the cost of chicken thighs, the latest thing the mayor wanted to do, the health or illness of relatives down south, Jesus, and a whole lot of topics that went way over my head were acts of women inserting themselves into history. Perhaps little h history, but as significant as any building block of a person's legacy. By just being alive and somehow managing to keep it together well enough to raise me, my older cousins, and the little ones coming up, by staying safe and sanctified and as whole as they could, these women embodied spirit, resilience, and bravery. Only decades later did I see that these women, my foremothers, forged a direct bridge to those who had come before. It was this very foremother spirit that visited me on Christmas Day in 2019, waking me from sleep with a whisper to tell my story. When that ancestral voice spoke to me across centuries, I believe, I felt called to meet as many of these women in history as I could, and to make them the center of a creative endeavor which I called the Brave Sis Project. This soon expanded into a dignified pantheon of women, Black, Brown, Asian, Indigenous, all of whom had far too often been forgotten, ignored, or erased, and in many cases were as anonymous as my aunties. In your hands, you hold only a petal of this ever expanding, intergenerational, intercultural bouquet of women being lifted into the significance they deserve. Our Brave Foremothers presents 100 women who changed the course of United States history. Some of their names will be familiar, but many might be new to you. Following each profile is a prompt encouraging you to relate the story of every foremother to your own. It is my hope that in reading about these women, reflecting on their influence, and embracing the prompts, you will kindle some of your own fire, power, and promise. I hope you will become inspired to learn more about them, about yourself, and about other women who have great stories to tell, even if they don't necessarily look like you. This is the book's offering to help us impact the world in positive ways, as our foremothers did before us. Delving into history from the stance of a charmed story collector and not an academic has been both a privilege and a challenge. These women live in my heart, and I can't feel so bad about my daily blues when I consider the devotedness of Clara Brown, the fearlessness of Jovita Idar, the guts of Grace Lee Boggs, or the selflessness of Maria Louise Morrow Fox. And then I'll skip and say, so this is not meant to be a history book, but our storybook, something that is alive and in which you can also discover some of your being and life story. You may wish to read linearly from cover to cover, or you may just as readily flip the pages to find a story, illustration, or prompt that speaks to your interests and needs in a given moment. I recommend finding a beautiful notebook or journal for capturing your written reflections, visual creations, and inspirations that arise when reading the book and its prompts. If learning about these women inspires you to investigate other stories, other erased or forgotten or unappreciated lives, particularly in your own family or community, all the better. It is my dream that together, each in our own space, and perhaps in some collective ways as well, we will write new histories, celebrate more deeply, love more authentically, explore more fully, and be as brave as we each can be, and then beyond that.
Thank you so much for reading that. I definitely felt as in the book, it was just stories. didn't feel like history with a capital H. It's just
Mhm.
all of these different incredible stories. And I appreciated the prompts and how each prompt was related to each story. And it just made me pause and to reflect. So and with all these books, Mark, these were the ones that really stuck out for me. There's so many different surprises. I felt like, wow, there could be a movie written about any of these women. So Rosie, if you had to just choose one woman to talk about, though, who would you choose?
Well, I mean, we love all of our children equally, right? So, it's hard to choose, but I often when I'm asked, I often go with Ada Blackjack, who's actually the first person in the book. I talk about Ada a lot in various talks and things that I do. And what I love about Ada, well, first of all, her story is amazing. She joined an Arctic Circle expedition as the cook and seamstress because she was trying to make money to pay for her son who had tuberculosis and was in a sanitarium here in Seattle. And she'd been abandoned by her husband. She had no money. She was an Inupiat woman, and they didn't know what they were doing. They got to this Arctic Circle area, and there were no big game to eat, to hunt, and the guys were all a bunch of plunderers, European American guys and, like, Canadian dudes, and their boat got shipwrecked, and they were stuck, and she 3 of the guys went off to, like, go find help as if, right? There was no help, and they never came back. So she was left alone at the camp with this one guy who was dying of scurvy, and he was so mean to her. He, like, abused her and yelled at her, but she sacrificed. She's a very sacrificial woman, and she fed him first, and she took care of him until he died, and then she created, like, a boundary with, like, boxes and things so that the animals wouldn't eat his carcass. She was just very respectful. And then she finally and somehow she just, like, something kicked in, and she was like, "Okay, this is how you hunt. This is how you do this. This is how you do that." And she just, like, figured it all out. And then when they sent the rescue party, I think they didn't know that she was the only one, because I think if it had been just the one Indigenous woman, they wouldn't have sent the rescue party, honestly. But when the rescue party got her, they were like, "Oh, you could have survived another year up here." And she's like, "Please take me home." And then but what I really like about Ada's story, actually, not like, but what's remarkable about her story, it doesn't have a happy end, right? Like, she came back, she got her son, she had another kid, but she was sad and depressed her whole life. I would imagine it's a very traumatic experience. And she died destitute. And, so she's a hero, but not in that traditional Hollywood arc of, the triumphant end. Like, life went on with its inequities and, struggles. But I sort of feel by, like, starting the book with her and kind of opening up the exploration to someone whose story is not ideal, that's a form of tribute and respect that she never had in her life. And so that's important to me to do that as well. It's not always going to be like, some of the stories are truly triumphant and wonderful, but I wanted to give her that because she didn't have that, in her life, and can you
Mm.
imagine, like, living in the Arctic Circle? I mean, like, no. I mean, I would never survive that. And I just think she deserves. Yeah,
Yeah, and
it's
it
hard.
wasn't until you pointed out, yeah, she didn't have a happy ending. And actually, a lot of the women you profile in the book did not have happy endings. And yet, they, even if it's not success in the way that we think, they lived incredible lives.
They
And you made
mattered.
it to them here.
Yeah.
How did you said that you have this database of over 500 women. How'd you get down to 100? How'd you choose these 100? That must have been
That
really hard.
was the hardest part because I had constraints from my editor, right? Like, we agreed that I think 15 or 20 of the people in this book could be in my other journals, right? Because there are a lot. And the first journal was all about the first Black doctor, the first Black dentist, the first this, the first college this, the first, and then as it goes on, it's like, well, first isn't always the most important thing. any sort of remarkable life. So I moved away from that. But it was hard. I'm not gonna lie, it was hard to find the women because it was like, oh, I can't do her. I can't do Zora Neale Hurston, him looking at her photo here. But there were a few that I had to include, like Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman. And of course, they were in the first book. But I did a lot of research, Julie. I have, like I was telling you earlier, I have like this huge
Mm-hmm.
book called Notable Black American Women. This is one of 3 volumes. And one of the important things for the Brave Sis project and the book, not the social media account, but the books, is for the most part, I want to include women who have passed on to the foremother realm, right? So women who have died. Um, Lots of reasons for that. One is, look at Daniel Ortega from Nicaragua. When I was in college, we all had his poster on our walls. Now he's in control and he's a horrible dictator, right? And so, like, you just don't know what people are going to do at the end of their life. So I just, that was one constraint. And it was a challenge to find the women. I mean, and then Cicely Tyson died, and I called my editor and I was like, we got to get Cicely in here. So I'm going to take XYZ out, and she was like, okay, Um, and a couple of the other women in here too, Etel Adnan, she died over the course of putting the book together. So we had to, at the last minute, change it to the past tense. But that was a lot of work. I mean, these are, and also these are short. It's really, really hard to write, like, a 700 word or however many words it is
Mm-hmm.
profile. It's very, very hard. Polly Murray was the hardest one to write, and also Fannie Lou Hamer, because they did so many things in their life. But Polly Murray was the hardest for sure because, like, she kept saying, "Oh, it's a little too long," and I was like, "There's nothing left to take out." She was a poet, she was a professor, she was a lawyer. She wrote like Polly would be a trans man, the historians believe, if alive today. Wrote a case that Thurgood Marshall considered the Bible of the civil rights movement, became Episcopal minister, and is canonized as a saint. How can you put that into 700 words? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so it
You're
was.
so, I mean, that's actually, I really appreciated how there's such a level of consistency across the different profiles, because you did. And it's just like, here are the interesting bits. And it wasn't just professional, like, we got to also hear about their personal lives and their backgrounds and their families. So, no, you're not off the hook in terms of choosing the 100, though. So, they had to pass on. All right, that's a one. Did
Yeah,
you then go?
there are 3 living women in the book.
Oh,
Sonia
okay.
Sotomayor, Angela Davis, and Dolores Huerta.
Okay, so aside from that, did you then go, well, I want an equal representation of science and humanities? Or did you go like, okay, I want to make sure that, I mean, this is Black, Brown, Indigenous, and Asian. Did you go, oh, like I need to have, how did you choose the balance?
Yeah. That's a really great question. Because I really did want to have some sort of balance, but obviously there are more Black women than anyone else in the book, partially because there are books like that big one I just showed you. There's more body of scholarship and like co co with sort of curation around Black Americans than Asian and Indigenous. The other really big issue, although there are a lot of really incredible Asian women, I just got this book recently from the Wing Luck Museum, which is did I no I didn't say that right. Wing Luke.
Wing Luke.
Thank you, not love. Yeah, I'm tired today. I'm sorry. And they're talking about Mitsuye Endo, who is in my book as well. So there's a fair amount of Asian American history to be found, because Asian Americans from China and Japan specifically have been in the US for a long time and have experienced a lot of the inequities. The hardest to find are brown women. And a lot of that is because of colorism. A lot of that is because of the immigrant experience and wishing to integrate and assimilate into whiteness. And so until the 70s, a lot of South Asian women, Indian women, Latinx women, and like Arab women, etc., they were really not identifying as women of color. They were living their lives as white women. And so that's the hardest part to research for me. And that is the most challenging, for
Mm.
sure.
So even the process of research reflects what sources are available, and I hope that from this, it shows what opportunities there are too, right? We can
Yeah.
say, oh, there are gaps, and we can also look at that as those are opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, my dream is to do, not my dream, my a big goal for the future is to do a global Brave Sis, and I was thinking, ooh, I want to do one about like Black women in Southwest Asia and Black women from Palestine, because I was at this conference and I met all these literary people writing about them, and then I started researching it. I was so excited, Julie, and I started researching it, and they're just like, there are no stories. There are just none. There are no stories about Black women in Japan. Like maybe there were 2 or 3 and no one's written about them. And so it's my hope that people will just start becoming more interested in the stories that were not highlighted or uplifted as worthy of note. Right? I mean, we could talk to an elder relative and learn so much if we
Hmm.
just took the time to do it.
Hmm. And I think that's actually another thing that I found inspirational about the book, because it's just, oh, I bet these stories also exist within my own family, and I just need to ask.
Yeah.
Okay, so audience, please do, if you have any questions, please just put it in the just chat, and I'll start to field them. I do have questions, more questions for you though, Rosie. You had these illustrations are beautiful. Can you tell us more about your illustrator and how you work together?
Yeah, Joelle Avellino. The my editors found her, and they've been great. Like, because they're like, we found this illustrator. Do you want to work with her? And I was like, are you kidding? Because I knew Joelle. I had a T-shirt of hers, of Rosa Parks, and so I was like, oh my gosh, we're going to use her. That's the difference between going with, having the blessing of a national publisher as opposed to doing it yourself, right? Like my books, the first 2 years I hired like a cartoonist to do the illustrations because it was a coloring book. And then the one you have, the 2023, I did those illustrations myself, like using an app and like some, interesting things. So the fact that I could have a real live illustrator who is so good was amazing. She and I talked on Instagram and got to know each other. She is a French Congolese woman who lives in London, and she's an incredible illustrator. I didn't have any direct contact with her. It was all done through the once she was on board, it was all done through the editors.
Mm.
But it was interesting because they were very exacting. They were tough on me. They were like,
Mhm.
we don't want to use this word, it has to be that word. And I was like, no, it has to be this word. I remember with Bessie Stringfield, the motorcycle queen of Miami, I remember saying she pitched a penny to decide which road she would take, and they were like, what does pitch a penny mean? And I was like, oh my God, you're so young. What are you talking about? I was like, it means you flipped a penny. And
I
they were
didn't
like,
know that, Rosie. I
yeah,
didn't know
yeah. And,
that.
and, and, and they were like, well, why don't you say flipped a penny? I said, because I want to give it the time frame reference. In the 30s, people said pitched a penny. I was born in 1963, so when I was a kid, we still saw movies from the 30s. So I have an adjacency to that. And so we had a couple of little struggles through the editorial process, but it all worked out in the end.
Wow, I didn't realize that you didn't actually work directly with your illustrator, because looking through the book there, it feels seamless.
Yeah, I mean, I have Rachel Mount Pleasant at Workman is great. She owned this. This was her baby, and she really stewarded it well. And they gave me the chance to sign off on some of it. They were like, we wonder about this illustration. What do you think? Is this right? And a few times I was like, that's not right. But then like someone like this, like Martha, let me see if I can do this. Martha Louise Morrow Fox. Whoa, sorry. There are no photos of. And that's, and so she had to do a composite of like a woman leading blind children through the forest because there are no photos. And that was the case for several of these women. There were no illustrations because they weren't considered important enough to be photographed in their lifetime. Um, There's also Rebecca Lee. Well, there's a couple of people who is it? Oh my goodness, the first lawyer, I forget her name's just escaping me right now. And if you go and you research her and you go to Google, the images are not her because she died in
Mm.
1911. The images that they show are Marian Anderson, the opera singer. Because you look at the photo, the hair and the clothing, you're like, this is someone from the 40s, like clearly. This woman died in 1911. But it's on Google, and so it's like, so there's a lot of like, you gotta not just accept the first thing you see as being the right thing. And that's been
Mhm,
a
mhm.
great lesson for me as well.
Rosie,
Representation.
are there other kind of fun behind the pages facts that you can share in terms of making this book? And also, is there anything you would have done differently?
Um Differently, it's hard to say because I've been living with it for 2 years now. I think, um oh, I'll tell you. Okay, so this was really interesting. Let me see, I've gotta go this way. Maria Montoya Martinez, right? Oh, sorry, there we go. Like, I lived in New Mexico for 10 years, 12 years. So I know about San Ildefonso Pueblo, and I know about the Black pottery. And when Joelle sent in the first illustration, Maria was holding a pot that was like, um, like brown and ochre. And I was like, no. I said the whole point of her pottery is that it was this black on black. It was a very, very distinctive. And so there were a few moments like that where I had to use what I knew about the woman in question to like override the illustration. That was fun, actually. Here's another one, Emma Ping Lum. There are no photos of Emma. Emma was just like a lawyer. She was like this kind of badass single woman who like grew up in San Francisco and in Chinatown, and she had this independent life, but she loved to travel. So they did this Joelle did an illustration of her like on a beach in Hawaii, and that's just so cool because
Mhm.
it's like she's free, she's living her best life, and that would have been in like the 60s or 70s, and
So I
it's
did notice that some of the illustrations were more scenes and others were more portraits. So is it that if they actually had surviving pictures, there were more portraits, and the ones that Joelle had to make up were more of the scenery ones?
well, that's an interesting thing too from the behind the scenes point of view because it was really important to the editor that there be not too many illustrations that were like that. And so she would say things like, oh, that's too much like the illustration of so and so, so let's shift that slightly. Also, and this is true, you can depict famous people. So I could have put famous people in the original book, I discovered after the fact, as long as it's an artistic rendering, such as the artistic rendering is bigger than the actual. You can't do like a straight photo of someone. That's when you need to get permission. And so the editor was very clear about making sure that none of the photos looked too literal, right? And so it was a really interesting balance
Mm.
between, is there a photo, and for most of them I had to supply two sources for photos, and that's when it's great to have an actual artistic illustrator because she can see that and then reinterpret it in her way, which I don't have that skill.
Mm.
Even though I
So,
wanted to go to art school when I was in high school, I abandoned that plan, and so I don't have that skill.
well, you have the gift and talent of being a beautiful storyteller, though, and so we can't have it all. so
Maybe
so
next time,
as
yeah.
as we're coming up on our time, I just want to see your your book is going to launch on April 11th. Can you give us some? How are you feeling about this? How's this?
It's amazing. I mean, even when I was a little girl, I always wanted to be a writer. And so the funny thing is, a friend of mine who writes like fiction, right? She was like, "Oh, I'm so I'm so frustrated as a writer. I won't get published. And I said to her, don't get it twisted now. I did not write a memoir of going to my grandmother's grave and experience. I created content. I mean, this is a wonderful book. I mean, it really is. But it's also like digestible bites. It's a product that people want. And right? You know what I mean? I said to her, but I wrote it, so I'm a writer, And so I think part of the thing is moving away from this idea of it being just one way to be a writer, oh, I'm going to sit in my room with my quill and that's not what the real world is about in this moment. It's more important to me to get these stories out there and the inspiration out there than to sort of adopt some sort of writerly persona. I
Mm,
mean, this is part of my activism, I guess. It's very linked to what I do for a living as well at Camber, because it's really about, like I said, decentering the default whiteness narrative and giving Black, Brown, Asian, and Indigenous women to feel proud about themselves and their legacy and be like, wow, somebody told me that like they got an advance copy and they called someone because there was a woman from Ohio and they called a friend they knew and she was like, oh my God, that was my great aunt. Like, what?
wow.
Amazing, right? And so we can see our own history, we can see each other. I can look at Yuri Kochiyama, a Japanese American woman who became really good friends with Malcolm X, and the famous photo of Malcolm X where he's been assassinated and he's dying and being held by someone. That was her. She was his friend. And we need to know that, right? Like when we talk about in the media, oh, Black and Asian, strife in the community, there are all these examples where people loved and cared for each other across those manufactured
Mhm.
divides. So that's important. But also it's white women, because so many white women like love this. They're like, oh my gosh, why it's so unfair that these women are not heard of. I want to get in there and be an advocate for more women's stories getting out there. So there's something for everyone. Brave bros exist too. Like the dudes enjoy it as well. So, I feel good about that. I do.
So, Rosie, I appreciate how you said so decentering the narrative also is about delivering in different formats. So, one of the things I actually love following you on Instagram because you share a lot of these stories. Can you just tell, as we're closing, can you tell the audience what are different ways to reach you, to follow Brave Sis? How
Sure. Sure. Well, if you are connected with me on LinkedIn, you see the posts there every day. But the best way is to go to Instagram. It is Brave Sis Project. And I do these daily sistery lessons. And so you can look at these pictures and see many, many of these faces you don't know. I mean, Debbie Allen's there, Dionne Warwick, Michelle Obama. But there are a lot Oprah's there, okay, but there are a lot of women that no one's ever heard of or few people have. Queen Emma from Hawaii. There's one woman, the woman in the corner in the third column with the head wrap. She was a nun. She was a Black nun who is up for canonization now, and she was unbelievable. Sister Thea, like no one heard about her. Amazing, amazing woman. And so if you go to Brave Sis Project on Insta, you will see a daily sistery lesson. I also, do have a little shop with merch, like really cool t-shirts and my notebooks are great. Like I use my notebook every day. And so if anybody is interested in that, there is a code, and it helps because I have to start funding again to print the next one, right? The next journal. So everything helps and bring it out. But the most important, I think, is just to follow on Insta and share and elevate that platform. I really hope to get to a space where other people will start writing me and say, hey, have you heard of this person? Have you heard of
Mhm.
that person? And just try to build more. As you said, history, her story, our story, Lori. Exactly. That's the
Wow.
whole idea.
There's gonna be multiple volumes. I can imagine multiple volumes as you're getting more, and it's just gonna be this flywheel.
I
So
hope so.
exciting.
I
So
hope so.
Rose, so thank you so much, Rosie Kennedy, for sharing your story, for having this conversation. I'm so excited for April 11th, where I can, hey, today is launch day, get the book. And also pre-orders are good though. I ordered
Orders,
mine
great.
even before I met Rosie, right after the email introduction, I pre-ordered. So and
Yeah.
pre-orders always really help.
They
Thank
do.
you. Thanks to everyone out there who engaged in this conversation. This is our Behind the Pages Conversations with Leadership Authors. Please do subscribe to the Curiosity-based weekly newsletter, and that way you will get news and updates about our programming. And thank you so much for joining us today.